Well, I would like to welcome all of you to our webinar. Today, it's a great joy and honor to have Professor Cyril Hovorun with us. He is joining us from LA, from Los Angeles. He teaches there, and he also teaches in Stockholm. And he has a very rich bio, which you have read, I'm sure, on the web page. He has studied in Athens theology, so he's also fluent in Greek, but he will speak to us in English. Personally, I have read two of his books, both of them focusing on ecclesiology, I should say in a creative way, especially from an Orthodox perspective. But today, I think he's with us primarily to talk to us about something a little bit different, which is another field that he's an expert, and that has to do with the political theology of the Orthodox Church. So, Dr. Hovorun, we welcome you, and it's a great joy, and we thank you for accepting the invitation. I need to say, and let me make mention that it's a professor from Ukraine, from Kiev, Eduard Borosev, who suggested that, and he made the first connection, so we're grateful for that. So, Dr. Hovorun, the floor is yours. And yes, let me give this practical detail that if we have questions at the end, we do hope and anticipate that we'll have a Q&A time. You can use the Q&A button at the choice at the bottom, and you can send your question as Dr. Hovorun is giving his talk or later. Okay, so Dr. Hovorun, again, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure and honor to be with you. Να καλωσορίζω και στα ελληνικά όσοι συμμετέχουν και παρακολουθούν αυτό το webinar. And I will focus on indeed on the political theology, especially from the Eastern Christian perspective, Orthodox perspective. In the beginning, I should say that the Orthodox churches are the latecomers, the newcomers to the realm of political theology, to the field of political theology, as it developed in the last century. We could say that the last century, especially the second half, probably starting from the 1930s, until now, it's like a century of political theology. Some theologians coined or described the 20th century as the century of ecclesiology. I would add that it was also the century of political theology and continues to be. In this century of political theology, as I said, the Orthodox Church was a newcomer. And this is despite the fact that I believe that Christian political theology was invented in the Christian East, in the Greek-speaking milieu, and the figures such as Eusebius of Caesarea, Eusebius Caesarius, could be regarded as the father of Christian political theology, through his treatises on the church history, through his encomiastic works on the life and activities of Constantine the Great. He effectively established the field of political theology. Then, through the centuries of Byzantium, Eastern theologians continued contributing to the political theology. I would suggest that, for example, figures such as Athanasius of Alexandria was a significant contributor in he contraposed his political theology to the one of Eusebius. And if you take, for example, the famous Vios Agiou Antoniou, the life of Saint Anthony of Egypt, this work some scholars have suggested, was written by St. Athanasius in counterposition to Eusebius's work, A Life of Constantine. So while Eusebius wanted to stress the role of the state in the life of the church, survival of Christianity and revival of Christianity, Athanasius tried to stress the role of monasticism, the countercultural trend within Christianity, which was a political statement. And then this tradition continued somehow in the East. We could see the towering figure, for example, of St. Photius of Constantinople, Patriarch of Constantinople, who was a prominent Byzantine statesman and a theologian, and he produced some fine samples of political theology. It continued to, even Gregory of Palamas, for example, the medieval Greek archbishop from Thessaloniki, could also be seen as a figure, as a contributor to the Eastern Christian political theology. For example, he coined a phrase which I like, theandriki politia. Politia, well, those who speak Greek, they know the meaning of the word, and we could say that it could be translated in the modern vocabulary, in the modern language, as an ancient analog to the word society. And Gregory Palamas of Thessaloniki, while speaking about theandriki politia, he implied a kind of social dimension of the Christian life, and could be seen as a contributor to the Eastern Christian political theology. So despite these figures, despite the contribution that they made in the past, after the Middle Ages, Eastern Christianity took like a backseat in the theological developments and also in the developments of political theology, and joined the effort, like the ecumenical international effort to develop political theology, quite late. In the West, political theology was kind of re-emerged and was reinvented in the wake of the ideological developments in Western Europe. While we could consider Eusebius of Caesarea as the father of the Christian theology in general, the father of the modern political theology is considered to be Carl Schmitt, a German theologian, a Catholic scholar, we could say a theologian and a lawyer in ancient Roman law, who had contributed to the rise of Nazism, to the Nazi ideology. He coined the phrase political theology in German, politische Theologie, and he established some foundations for this new discipline, and he for example, suggested that the major secular political notions, they have some religious roots, they have some religious background, which was a very insightful outlook that he suggested. And of course, he used this outlook to promote his own cause, which was the cause of Nazism. Carl Schmitt invented or reinvented, we would say, political theology, and he spoiled it. He made it toxic immediately, so that there were conversations after the World War II that political theology should be abandoned altogether. It cannot stand as it was under Carl Schmitt because it was burdened with the legacy of Nazism, of the totalitarian ideologies that had led to the World War II. Despite these conversations, these suggestions, a different approach was suggested by some other German theologians, including Jürgen Moltmann, for example, who suggested that we should continue using should continue using the term political theology, and but this political theology needs to be reinvented again. And indeed, Jürgen Moltmann, he rebranded political theology. He reinvented it again, and he suggested that political theology we can continue speaking political theology after the World War II only as theology after Auschwitz, in the wake of the tragedy that happened during the World War II. And political theology can be eligible only as far as it contributes to the construction of the totalitarian ideologies and theologies of the past. So it continued like this, political theology after the World War II, and continues to our days. In most cases, political theology is quite liberal, is quite progressive, and quite anti-totalitarian, quite anti conservative, I would say. Well, those were like the developments in the political theology after the World War II. There was no much contribution from the Orthodox perspective to this political theology. There were some, of course, some contributors, such as, for example, a Greek theologian from Thessaloniki, Kathitis Savas Agouridis, quite famous biblical scholar, as probably some of you know, and also a prominent theologian in this line of political theology. He was also very liberal, progressive, quite critical about all different sorts of Byzantinism. And yet, despite him, the contributors like him, the mainstream political theology, especially in Greece, denied even the existence of political theology. There is such a trend in the Western political theology. There are the discussions about about legitimacy of political theology after Carl Schmitt. They continue on somewhere on the margins of political theology. So there are some scholars that still question whether it is possible to speak about political theology, whether it is a legitimate theological discipline. But I would say those conversations happen mostly on the margins of political theology, of the main field of political theology. In Greece, however, such conversations became mainstream. So the voices, such as the voice of Sava Agouridis, which would constitute the mainstream in the West, in Greece, in the Eastern Christian milieu, became a voice of minority. The voice of majority, however, agreed that political theology is something bad, something not legitimate, something to be avoided. And the most representative voice of this trend is the voice of Christos Yanaras, another famous Greek theologian who still lives. And he is probably the most important figure in modern Greek political theology, and generally speaking, in the modern Orthodox political theology. So Yanaras, even though he published a book, Political Theology, which is a collection of his articles, basically in the Greek newspaper Tovima, that he published after Metapolitevsi, after the fall of the dictatorship in Greece in 1974, mostly in the 1980s, I think. Those articles, he collected them into this volume, which he titled Political Theology. Despite this title, he denies that political theology is a legitimate discipline, at least for the Orthodox theologians. He argues that political theology is a Western invention. It's non-orthodox. It's heretical. It should not be accepted into the Orthodox theology, and well, he essentially made this as a paradoxical statement, because he in reality has produced political theology, and yet he denies a political theology for the Orthodox. Only recently, the situation started changing the tide somehow changed, and now the Orthodox, they invest themselves more and more into political theology, into the discussions about political theology. And I may mention such names as Teli Papanikolaou from Fordham University in the United States, Pantelis Kalatzidis from the Volos Theological Academy, who contribute to the discussion about political theology widely. In the Orthodox milieu, what we observe regarding political theology is something that happens when you deny something and it comes back through the back door and takes you by surprise. That's exactly what happened to political theology. While the majority of the Orthodox theologians of the generation of Christos Yanaras, including Christos Yanaras, they deny political theology as such, political theology nevertheless comes through the back door, and it takes us by surprise. So it happened with the recent developments in the Orthodox world, particularly the war in Ukraine. This war, in contrast to, for example, the World War I or World War II, even though they say that this war in Ukraine now is very similar in many points to World War I and World War II, for example, we observe that now in Ukraine it's really the war in trenches, as it was in the World War I. It's the war of ordinary soldiers, ipeziki, who fight this war. Even though we have drones now and sophisticated radio systems and so forth, it is still the war of trenches, the war of ordinary people with a rifle in their hand. Even though there are so many similarities between the World War I and World War II and the Ukrainian war, there are some radical differences. For example, one of the most important differences is that the World War I and particularly the World War II were secular wars. In contrast to the European wars in the early modernity, which were fought in the name of religion, especially the 30s year war in the beginning of the 17th century, which was fought between essentially the Catholics and the Protestants. The modern wars, including the world wars, they are secular. They have nothing to do. They have nothing to do with religion. They are underpinned by secular ideologies, the clash of the secular ideologies such as nationalism and Marxism. In the case of the World War II, and religion didn't play any significant role. In the case of Ukraine, the religion does play a significant role in waging this war in Ukraine. It is underpinned very much by religion, and I would say the church appears to be the main promoter of this war, the main justificator, the main rationalizator, the main kind of institution that gives sense to this senseless war, or tries to give sense, of course, and tries to bring up theological arguments, including arguments from political theology. While people like Avouridis and Yanaras, for example, could be considered as the founders of the Greek political theology, the founder of the Russian political theology, well, we could trace it back to the figures like Father Sergei Bulgakov, for example, or Nikolai Berdyaev, or others, but the kind of current mainstream in the Russian political theology was established by Patriarch Kirill. I believe Patriarch Kirill, he is, even though he's not a trained theologian, he is like a theologian by God's feeling, as it were. He made a major contribution to the formation of the modern Russian political theology, and he is one of the main, if not the main, political theologian of the Russian church nowadays himself. He has ideas, and he develops those ideas, and he imposes those ideas upon the church, upon his church. So he introduced a new sort of political theology to the Russian church, which exactly underpins this war. This is a political theology of exclusivism, of nationalism, even though it presents itself as a theology that protects, religion, protects the church, fights against secularism, fights against liberalism, decadence, whatever they call by that. it constitutes a sort of exclusivism, meaning that they believe that what they have and what they try to protect is much more superior than what they want to protect. Their faith, what they call civilization, which is shaped by the Orthodox faith, and that's what they try to protect. And they explain that this war in Ukraine is about protection, about protecting the core of the essence, quintessence of the Russian Orthodox civilization against the advances of the West, against the advances of the as they believe, the heretical Western civilization. As with other ideologies of exclusivism that became popular in the Orthodox Church, this ideology of the Russian world is very paradoxical. Let me say, to explain myself, let me say a few words about the origins of the ideology of nationalism. This ideology is quite new. It emerged in in Western Europe, primarily in France, and then it had its own spin in Germany in the framework of the Enlightenment, more or less in the 17th, 18th centuries. It emerged as a secular phenomenon, as a result, a fruit of secularization of the Western societies, especially Western intellectual circles. And nationalism in its original form, as it emerged in the framework of the Enlightenment, presupposed or was designed to be an alternative to religion, not a supplement to religion, but an alternative to religion. And yet, when it was planted to the Orthodox soil through the figures like Adamantios Korais, for example, the famous Greek figure of the Greek Enlightenment, intellectual and political and social figure, and also a church figure, actually, because he was a theologian as well to some extent. He wrote a catechesis, for example, and he had an interest in theological matters, and yet he was the one who, among those who brought nationalistic ideologies to the Greek soil, or broader speaking, to the soil, Orthodox soil within the confines of the Ottoman Empire. And he brought this ideology as a secular phenomenon, but it became very soon appropriated by the church circles. Even those circles that were against the Western secularism, they had adopted nevertheless nationalism as an ideology which was originally secular and Western, intrinsically secular and Western. The Orthodox circles adopted this ideology of nationalism as if it was autochthonic, natural, originally Eastern and Orthodox. And a very strange marriage happened between the circles that promote, very strongly anti-Westernism and religious identity, anti-secularism, with an ideology which was exactly in the beginning intrinsically secular and Western, the ideology of nationalism. And since then, this marriage between the secular ideology of nationalism and orthodoxy has become very successful and brought a lot of children. Something similar happened to this ideology of the Russian world, I would say, which is a sort of nationalism. However, it's not really the ethnic nationalism. It's a sort of civilizational exclusivism, which claims that there is a super ethnos, which comprises different ethnic groups who may speak different languages, but they belong to the same civilization. And the Russians include to this super ethnos also Ukrainians, Belarusians, even Moldovans and Kazakhs, and you name them, all those former Soviet nations, including some Slavic nations that never belonged to the Soviet Union. So they claim that they constitute a unique and consistent civilization that is superior to the Western civilization, because just by the fact that it is Orthodox, and Orthodoxy is superior to other, they believe, religious traditions. Therefore, their civilization is superior to other civilizations, particularly the Western civilizations. And on the basis of this exclusivism, they claim that they have to fight for their civilization. They started this war against Ukraine as a means of protecting themselves from, so they explain it, against the West. Of course, it's completely delusional. It's completely fantastic, this explanation, but that's how they explain themselves and how they explain this war. And this allows us to understand better their motivation. Their motivation is purely, clearly nationalistic, even though they are not speaking about just the Russian ethnos. They speak about other ethnic, other nations as well, as belonging to this imagined civilization of the Russian world. And even though this sort of exclusivism, this sort of nationalism also has a very secular origin. For example, it was articulated by the people, by the thinkers in the Western Europe, such as Spengler. I would not say that, I would not call him a Christian thinker at all. I would call him rather the opposite to that. Or Toynbee, for example, a British historian who was not particularly religious. So it's I would not call the origins of this Russian world ideology as religious. Nevertheless, there was this, again, strange marriage between the idea of civilization, the idea of exclusivism, and the Christian Church. I should also say that, in my judgment, the idea of civilization is quite anti-Christian. Why so? Because Christianity claims to be universal, claims to reach out to any civilization, claims to be applicable, to be relevant to any social group, any entity in either political or social in this world. Therefore, all civilizations are supposed to be penetrable by Christianity, and Christianity cannot confine itself to a civilization. When Christianity confines itself to a civilization, it means that it reduces itself. It reduces itself in the same way as it reduces itself in the framework of any nationalism. Therefore, the idea of civilization, the idea of Christianity are incompatible, are completely in opposition to one another. And yet, this idea of civilization became very popular in Russia and became really like the new orthodoxy, in the Russian church. Yes, it underpins the war. It drives the masses of Russians, millions of Russians, to support this war, to go and fight in this war, because they believe that they protect their civilization, their unique civilization. There was an analogy in the beginning of the 20th century between the same driving forces. The ethnic nationalism that emerged in the Balkan countries, which had separated, which had become independent from the Ottoman Empire, including Greece. They ended up eventually in the Balkan Wars, two Balkan Wars which were waged and fought in the beginning of the 20th century. Those wars were, at the second stage at least, mostly the wars between Orthodox nations. The Orthodox nations who were supposed to be in agreement with one another, in solidarity with one another, they nevertheless started fighting each other. That war, those wars, the Balkan Wars, were an instance of nationalism in action, in the same way as now the civilizational nationalism or exceptionalism that Russia demonstrates is the cause of the war, of the wars which evolve in Eastern Europe and in the Caucasian region as well, because this series of wars started in 2008 with the partial occupation of Georgia by Russia, another Orthodox country, ancient Orthodox country occupied by Russia. And while there is unfortunately an option there is still a possibility that this war will not end in Ukraine. It will spread further, and the Russians don't hide their intention, if they succeed in Ukraine, to go further and to spread this war, to protect their civilization, as they say, as they explain it, wherever they can reach. So this madness should be stopped. And I think there are two ways to stop the war and to contain the Russian aggression. The first one is through the military confrontation. That is the only way. That's what we do in Ukraine. We fight back. We protect our country. We fight back. For this reason, we don't hide that we need weapons, we need support, military support, including military support. And by the way, we are quite grateful to the European nations, including Greece, for supporting us. But also we need a different sort of weapons, ideas. We need to deconstruct the ideology of the Russian world, which we believe is another sort of weapon used against the peaceful nation of Ukraine. And I think we need a sort of pan-Christian solidarity from different Christian groups and traditions to figure out how to oppose, what arguments to find against the Russian world ideology. So that's I'd like to say these last words in my presentation as a sort of invitation to all of us to think together and to figure out how we could oppose this ideology of the Russian world together.
Let me say, you can start sending questions if you have any, using the option at the bottom of your screen. Okay, great. Dr. Hovorun, thank you so very much. You did two things at one. First of all, you gave us a background, a general introduction to political theology and the developments, starting from Eusebius, coming all the way to today. So that was very, very helpful for all of us to give us the context. And also thank you for your references to the Greek theologians, because some of us were quite familiar with that. And then, of course, you applied all of that to the recent situation, to the Ukrainian situation. So thank you so very much. It was very informative. And as I said, you can, if you have, I'm addressing the participants. If you have questions, you can now send them, so we can have a discussion. There is, I mentioned at the beginning, this, I think it was an article written by Professor Vasilios Makridis, and I still remember the title, and it was affirmative, saying why Orthodox countries are prone to nationalism. So for him, there was no question. Can you, make a more general comment whether you agree with that statement? Of course, he gives some historical explanations like the ones that you just mentioned, about the Balkan countries and the, that, so to say, national ideology was kind of connected with religious expectations, and so there was a historical constituency. Is that all? Do you think that there is something deeper than that? So what would be your response?
Yeah, well, I concur with the conclusion of my very good colleague and friend Vasilios Makridis. I agree that the Orthodox are particularly susceptible, vulnerable to nationalism, and I believe this is because of the specific structure of the global Orthodoxy. As you probably know, global Orthodoxy is divided into local churches, topiches ecclesias, and each church is autocephalous, which goes back to the times when they existed within the same state, within the Roman Empire. So those autocephalous churches emerged within the same state, and they were established in order to facilitate the management of the global Christianity within the Roman Empire. and outside it, actually, because Christianity spread even beyond the Roman Empire, especially to the Persian world and so forth, where the autocephalous churches were established as well. But with the collapse of the Roman Empire, including the Eastern Roman Empire, known as Byzantium, the structure of the Orthodox churches changed. Now the Orthodox churches became contained within the ethnic state. And now autocephaly was kind of reapplied, reinvented in order to reflect this new structure of the statehood of the states, especially after the full collapse of the Ottoman Empire, but also after the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Habsburg Empire, which also contained some Orthodox nations. And then the Russian Empire also came and collapsed, and some new Orthodox nations emerged from that. So as a result of the collapse of the empires of the 19th century, and as a result of the emergence of the nation state, autocephaly became affiliated closely with the ethnic state, with the nation state, and enhanced the idea of ethnic identity to the extent that it became like a common rule that any ethnic state that emerged to be to claim its rights to exist as an independent state, it had to have several features. Like it had to have its own language, it had to have its own educational system, independent from the imperial systems, and it had to have its own autocephalous church. So the structure of the autocephalous churches, those local churches, independent from each other, facilitated and enhanced this tendency towards nationalism. Those tendencies were quenched in the Catholic Church, for example. There were attempts in the Catholic Church to have ethnic, nationalistic states. Like, for example, in the case, it started, I think, under the French monarchy, especially Louis XIV, who tried to introduce the so-called Gallicanism, like an independent from Rome church. It continued in the Austro-Hungarian Empire with the so-called Febronianism, I think, with attempts to establish kind of a semi-independent church from Rome. But those tendencies were neutralized eventually especially through the so-called ultramontanistic movement in the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. So in the Catholic Church, we had the same tendency towards nationalism, but the structure of the Catholic Church, the kind of uniform structure, neutralized those tendencies. But in the Orthodox Church, in contrast to that, the structure of the autocephalous churches enhanced the tendencies towards nationalism. Therefore, I would say that's one of the main reasons why the Orthodox churches appear to be so susceptible, vulnerable to nationalism.
Yeah, that's very, very helpful. Thank you. We have a couple of questions. I have some of mine, but I'll keep them to see if we have time at the end. So there is one that says, Kostas Stoupas, in his book, The Coming Disorder, says that Russia attacks Ukraine in order to challenge democracy and Western civilization and ideology. And for this reason, EU and USA are supporting Ukraine. Do you agree with that?
Yes, well, Russia certainly wants to challenge the global democracy. Russia is a totalitarian state, and it allies with other totalitarian states across the globe, including Iran, North Korea, and so forth, and tries to really challenge the global order and more importantly, the global democracy. Well, Ukraine is a democracy, and Ukraine is a democracy that fights for itself. At the same time, the Russians also want to exterminate, the Ukrainian identity and people as such. They claim that Ukraine should not continue to exist. So we consider the actions of Russia against Ukraine as genocidal, essentially. They're very, very much similar to what the Ottomans did to the Pontic Greeks, for example, in Pontus, or what they did to Armenians. They wanted to either to Islamize Armenians and to get rid of their identity, Armenian identity. That's why for example, they started with killing the intellectuals and church figures who preserved the Armenian identity. They were happy to assimilate Armenians, to make them Turks. And many of them, as we know, Armenians became Turks and survived in this way. In the same way, Russians want Ukrainians to become Russians, and that to leave them the only option to survive, to become Russians and to get rid of their own identity. Therefore, it's more than just the fight for democracy in Ukraine. It's also, for us, it's the fight for our survival as a people, you know.
Yeah, that's pretty clear. There is another question which you have already touched upon, but let me read it because it may give some more food for thought. This embrace of nationalism is not present also in Catholic countries as well, in certain historical periods and possibly in another context, for example, Croatia, Spain. So,
yeah, of course. As I said, there is such a tendency in the Catholic Church. We have a number of nationalism in the Catholic countries, like Polish, for example. Polish nationalism is very prominent. Or now take Hungarian. I mean, under Orbán, it's mostly a Catholic country. They promote the Catholic Church there, and they are like, I consider Hungary as kind of semi-fascist state nowadays in modern European Union, and they support the Catholic Church, and they're supported by the Catholic Church. Not everyone in the Catholic Church. I think they don't find much support from Pope Francis personally, but certainly the local hierarchs, they're very much in support of Orban and so forth. But again, I should say that I mentioned of Pope Francis. He represents kind of a superstructure in the Catholic Church that kind of tries to neutralize, tries to contain those negative tendencies of nationalism in the countries like Hungary, for example.
yeah, let me add here, couldn't be the Patriarch of Constantinople play a similar role in
Somehow,
terms
yes,
of the
that's true.
Orthodox?
Exactly so. I believe that the Patriarch of Constantinople tries to play this role to warn and to prevent some churches from slipping to ethnophilitism. Of course, this teaching was condemned at the Council of Constantinople in 1870. And then this condemnation was reaffirmed in the Pan-Orthodox Council, which happened in Crete,
Yes.
2016. And the Patriarch of Constantinople consistently repeats the unacceptability of ethnophilitismos among the Orthodox. It doesn't help very much, I mean, to fight
Yeah,
ethnophilitism.
yeah, and especially
A lot
for the
of people.
council, the Russian Orthodox sabotaged it, and it didn't.
Exactly.
So, um, well, let me, as we come to, I would like to respect the time. Let me, as we bring that to a close, let me say this. A couple of years ago, I started studying the phenomenon of nationalism, as I said, reading books and, the work of Vasilis Makridis and other people. And as Protestant, it was very easy for me to criticize, the phenomenon in the Eastern Orthodox world. But soon enough, you come to realize that, this Christian nationalism, which is becoming very prominent, especially in the United States. So we have different types of nationalism. So I would like you, because we talked already about Eastern Orthodoxy and even about Roman Catholicism, if you have any comment or any warning that you may address, since you're in the United States, for the Protestant world, and and the way, the temptation to ethnophyletism and nationalism, in the Protestant context.
Well, I think, yes, you are right that it is a phenomenon which is not just Eastern Christian Orthodox. It's global, unfortunately. It's not just Christian, but Christianity is quite vulnerable to it. And I should remind that the Reformation started with some sort of encouragement of nationalism. When the German
Yes. Oh, yeah.
princes supported Luther in the 16th century, they supported him not just because they loved the ideas that he promoted, but also he gave them a chance, an opportunity to increase their political weight vis-a-vis Rome, and to increase this contributed to German nationalism. And I should say that even the rise of Nazism could be, to some extent, the Nazis, they appeal to Luther. They believe that some Nazis believed, for example, that they accomplish the work which was unfinished by Luther. So essentially, they
Yes.
believe that Nazism is the kind of the ultimate point of the Reformation. Wrongly so, of course. They misunderstood the Reformation, but still they believed so.
Yes.
And I should also say that speaking about the United States, a warning to the Protestant brothers and sisters. I think the most important thing I wanted to say is don't get fascinated by symphony with the state. Symphony,
Yes.
which we had in the Orthodox Church, we had a lot of bitter experience with the symphonies. We still have a lot of bitter experiences with symphony. We invented symphony in the past under Constantine, and it continued like through the centuries. But then I think it's better for the state to be outside of the symphonic relationship with the state. It's better to have a partnership based on mutual respect and not on the preferences and privileges. Something that I expect that I see in the United States, some Protestant groups, evangelical groups in the United States, they are eager to establish a sort of symphonic relationship of the Byzantine type with the White House, and unfortunately, some presidential candidates like Trump, they encourage this kind of desires among the evangelicals, and I think this is very wrong. It's something to be avoided. Don't repeat our mistakes.
Yes, thank you. There is, and we'll keep that as a final question. It comes from Petro Kovalev, and let me read it. Russia presents itself as the global guardian and defender of traditional values, thinking of itself as a unique civilization while portraying the West as a promoter of decadent values. Many conservative Christians of various denominations want to ally with Russia in what they see as a common moral cause, but they also extend the support of Russia in regards to the present war. What do you feel can be done to deal with this trend? So there is this appeal that, it's quite, how can
It's
I
quite
say?
appealing. It's very
Yes,
appealing, very attractive for many Christians across the
yes,
globe. That's true. But the reality is that this is just what Russia tries to sell to the world. It's not what it is. The reality is very different. The reality
yes,
is that Russia, yes, they say that we protect family. And what they do in Ukraine, they destroy the Institute of Families in Ukraine. Now, millions of families have been damaged in Ukraine as a result of the war, with the fathers being killed in the war. Some children are orphans. Some children have been killed. I mean, over 500 children have been killed in this war. Many lost all their parents or just one parent, the father in the war. Many families became separated because the mothers brought their children to the West as refugees, and children haven't seen their fathers for 2 years now. Those families are dysfunctional. So the
yes,
Russians, while saying that we protect families, they do destroy in reality family. So that
yes,
is the main message. Whatever they claim and whatever they do, they are the opposites. When the Russians claim something, it means what they do is the opposite to what they claim. And this hypocrisy needs to be stressed.
yes. Well, thank you. There is one more question. It gets people are warmed up as the end approaches. I always thought that comes from a Greek
Right?
brother. I always thought that Korais was a globalist as far as Balkans concerned and not a nationalist. Please help us see how was he ethnocentric.
Yes. Well, Correis was a very complicated figure, and of course, he was not just one-dimensional.
Yes,
He was an Enlightenment figure. Well, he was a secularist, and at the same time, he was a theologian. He was a globalist, and at the same time, he was a nationalist. Because nationalism was a very fashionable idea at the time. The idea which actually was very emancipatory. It would
yes.
help the Greeks, for example, to emancipate from the Ottoman Empire. Nationalism was the way. And in the
It was
beginning,
progressive. It was at
it
that
was
time. It was
a
anti-authority.
very good idea at the beginning.
Yes,
And
yes,
then it changed. It became really a very bad idea. It turned
yes,
into a bad idea. But in the time when Croats tried to bring it to Greece, uh, this um, this idea of uh, trans transfer of metakenosis, I think he used this word, from Europe, some European ideas to the Greek soil, to transplant those ideas to the Greek soil. Among those ideas was the idea of nationalism. And originally it was the idea of emancipation from the empire, and eventually it became mostly affiliated with particularism, with this narrow-mindedness of the small nations in the Balkans. But it became like that later on.
Yeah.
What is important that this idea originally was also very secular, and it became all of a sudden very religious.
Yeah.
That's another part.
Yes, that's this paradox. I mean, you can see that in Yanaras and in all this line of thinkers that they're so anti-Western, using
Very
totally
Western
Western
ideas. For
categories.
me,
And
I know Christos Yanaras personally. I have known him since I was a student, and for me, he was the most Western Greek thinker I ever met.
yes, oh yeah,
No,
yeah,
very,
in
in many
many
ways.
ways. Yeah, so this is the paradox, as you said. That is, yeah. I think this is the time to conclude. Again, thank you so very much for this wonderful talk. It was very informative, but also, uh, it was challenging because it helps us see that theology is not an academic discipline only for schools, but here we have a very real life situation. I need to tell you that our church hosts Ukrainian families, and it's exactly what you said, families that are separated. The fathers, they're fighting, and the wives with the children. And so we try to,
Thank you so much.
whatever means.
I
Yeah,
want to
we have,
this opportunity
yeah,
to
we have, yeah. One of the, let me finish with that, because in a more pastoral, so to say, note, there was this family. We have 3 apartments that we use now to host Ukrainian families, and we have many Ukrainians who were in Greece even before the war. So, and we have all these connections. There is this family that they're from Odessa, and when the war started, they had a Jewish origin. So they made their papers and they went to Israel. And of course,
They
they
were not
put,
allowed at that time. Many Ukrainians were not allowed to Israel, unfortunately.
yeah, but they went to Israel, and they were in a village near the borders of Gaza.
Mm.
And guess what happens? There is this invasion in their village. They take a suitcase, they run to the airport. The first airplane they managed to get on, they took, and they landed in Greece. And so we provide, for them, we host them, and it's very traumatized. And so it's the reality of war is terrible. And I need to tell you, as we conclude, that many evangelicals, at least the ones that we know, they don't like Putin at all, and they were very anti-war, speaking openly against the war right from the beginning. So well, once again, thank you so very much, and may God bless you and what you do. And thank all of you for participating in the questions and, participating in the webinar. So till our next one, may God be with you all. Thank you.
Thank you. All the best to you. And thank you for everything you do.